A stray's silent plea. The morning air was crisp and carried the faint aroma of fresh bread, drifting from the small bakery nestled between the towering buildings of New York City. The city was already alive, with hurried footsteps echoing along the pavement, taxis honking impatiently, and the occasional laughter of early morning commuters rushing to their destinations. But amidst the bustling crowd, one figure remained still. A golden retriever, his fur matted and unkempt, sat quietly on the sidewalk, just outside the bakery's large glass window. His deep brown eyes, filled with a mixture of hunger and longing, were locked onto the freshly baked loaves displayed inside. Unlike other strays who barked, begged, or scavenged, he did not make a sound. He simply sat there, waiting, hoping. But in a city that never stopped moving, no one stopped for him. A familiar presence. Maria adjusted the trays of warm croissants behind the bakery counter, her hands working automatically as she greeted customers. The cozy shop, Maria's Bakes and Brews, had been in her family for years, passed down from her grandmother. She had seen many stray dogs wandering the streets of Brooklyn, but something about this one made her pause. For the past 3 mornings, he had been there. Same spot, same silent, longing gaze, never barking, never whining, just watching. Maria wiped her hands on her apron and peered through the glass window. The retriever's thin frame, the slight trembling of his legs, and the way his ears drooped pulled at something deep inside her. He was starving. And yet, despite his desperation, he didn't beg. A customer's voice snapped her out of her thoughts. "Maria, another espresso, please." She nodded, forcing a smile as she went back to work. But her mind stayed on the dog outside. Why was he here? And more importantly, who was he waiting for? A city that doesn't stop. Outside, the golden retriever's nose twitched as the scent of buttery pastries and warm bread filled the air. His stomach growled. He had gone days without food. But still, he did not move. People passed by, glancing at him briefly before continuing on with their lives. Some looked away in guilt, others simply ignored him. A young man with a coffee in hand hesitated near the entrance, frowning at the sight of the dog. He glanced down at his half-eaten bagel, then at the retriever. A moment of indecision. And then, he tossed the bagel into the trash and walked away. The dog's ears perked slightly, but he remained where he was. Maria saw it all. Her chest tightened. New York was a city of movement, but sometimes it was also a city of indifference. The first step. As the day stretched into afternoon, the golden retriever finally did something different. He moved. Slowly, almost cautiously, he stood and took a few steps toward the bakery door. Maria had just stepped outside to throw away leftover bread when she felt something cold and damp brush against her hand. She froze. The retriever had lifted a paw, gently placing it against her wrist, a silent plea. Maria's breath caught in her throat. She had expected the dog to lunge for the bread, but instead he simply touched her, as if asking for something more than food, as if asking for a chance. The moment stretched. The sounds of the city faded into the background. For the first time since she opened her bakery, Maria felt like time had stopped. A stranger passing by scoffed. "You're not seriously thinking about taking that thing inside, are you?" Maria ignored him. She looked down at the retriever. And in that moment, she made a decision. She opened the bakery door. "Come on, boy," she said softly. For a moment, the dog hesitated, as if he couldn't believe the invitation was real. Then, cautiously, he stepped inside. A warm place at last. The golden retriever shook his body, sending small drops of rainwater scattering onto the wooden floor. Maria grabbed a clean towel and quickly wiped the mess, glancing at the dog as he stood near the counter, his eyes scanning the cozy shop. She expected him to jump at the food, but he didn't. Instead, he sat down quietly, his tail curling around his paws as if waiting for permission. Maria's heart ached. She grabbed a small bowl, filled it with fresh water, and set it on the floor. The retriever licked his lips but didn't move. Maria kneeled beside him and gently nudged the bowl closer. "It's okay," she whispered. "You can drink." Finally, the retriever leaned forward and lapped at the water, his movements slow, as if he were savoring every drop. As she watched him, Maria felt something strange stir inside her, something she hadn't felt in a long time. A memory. A golden retriever. A childhood she had tried to forget. More than just a stray. By evening, the bakery had settled into its usual rhythm. Customers had come and gone, and yet the golden retriever remained. Maria had placed a soft blanket in the corner, and the dog had curled up there, his eyes half-lidded with exhaustion. She found herself stealing glances at him, unable to shake the feeling that this was more than just a stray. That he had a story, that he had a past, and that maybe, just maybe, he had been waiting for someone all along. Maria sat down beside him on the floor, her voice barely a whisper. "What happened to you, boy?" The retriever lifted his head and looked at her, his deep brown eyes filled with something Maria couldn't explain, something that made her chest tighten. And in that moment, she knew. This wasn't just a lost dog. This was fate. The road to truth begins. The van rumbled down the dark highway, its battered frame rattling over the uneven pavement. The headlights cut through the night, illuminating the road ahead. But Connor Raven Hayes barely noticed. His attention was locked on the wounded German shepherd lying in the back of the van. Duke's breathing was still shallow, his chest rising and falling in uneven rhythms. The dog's fur was damp with blood, and every so often, a weak whimper escaped his throat. Connor sat beside him, cradling the dog's massive head in his lap, his fingers brushing over the bulletproof K9 vest. The police insignia on the vest was scratched and faded, but the weight of what it represented hung heavy in the air. Rick was gripping the steering wheel so hard his knuckles were white. His eyes flicked to the rearview mirror every few seconds, checking for flashing red and blue lights. "Damn it, Raven," he muttered. "Do you even realize what you've done?" Connor didn't respond. He knew exactly what he had done. He had just stolen a police K9 dog from an active crime scene, evaded the cops, and dragged his entire crew into a mess that could bury them. He had broken the unspoken rule they all lived by: never get involved in something that wasn't their fight. But this was his fight now. He reached for the camera attached to Duke's vest and pressed the playback button again. The screen flickered to life, replaying the final moments before Duke had been injured. The footage was grainy but clear enough to see the dark sedan speeding alongside the patrol car, masked gunmen firing wildly. Connor could hear the officer, Duke's handler, shouting commands. The K9 lunged into action, fearless despite the chaos. Then the screen jolted. A sudden impact. A deafening blast. Static. Connor exhaled sharply and shut the screen off. Whoever these men were, they weren't amateurs. Rick let out a frustrated sigh, snapping Connor from his thoughts. "I don't know what you think you're gonna do, man, but we can't keep this dog. The cops are already on high alert. Hell, we're probably plastered on every damn news channel right now." "I don't care," Connor muttered. Rick let out a dry laugh, shaking his head. "Of course you don't." The rest of the gang was quiet in the back, exchanging uneasy glances. They were all tough guys, hardened by the roads and the rough life they had chosen. But even they knew this was uncharted territory. Then, Duke shifted in Connor's lap. The dog let out a pained grunt, his body trembling slightly. Connor's jaw tightened. "He needs a vet." Rick scoffed. "And where exactly do you plan on finding a vet that won't turn us in the second we walk through the door?" Connor didn't answer, because he already knew exactly where they were going. The past that never left. 20 minutes later, the van pulled up outside a small run-down building at the edge of town. The old wooden sign above the entrance read, "Dr. Emily Carter, Veterinary Clinic." Rick stared at the sign, then at Connor. "No way," he said, shaking his head. You cannot be serious." Connor ignored him and climbed out of the van. He carefully lifted Duke into his arms, mindful of the dog's injuries. Duke whimpered but didn't resist. Rick was right to be skeptical. Emily Carter was the last person Connor wanted to see. But she was the only one who could help. He walked up to the door and knocked twice. Silence. Then the sound of footsteps. The door creaked open just a sliver, revealing a woman in her mid-30s with piercing green eyes and auburn hair tied back in a messy bun. She looked at Connor, then at the bleeding dog in his arms. Her brows furrowed. "Connor." "Hey, Em," he said, his voice softer than usual. Her gaze hardened instantly. "Oh no. No. Whatever this is, I'm not getting involved." Connor took a deep breath. "I wouldn't have come if I had any other choice." Emily crossed her arms. "I haven't seen you in 5 years, and now you show up on my doorstep in the middle of the night, covered in blood, carrying an injured police dog. Do you have any idea what this looks like?" Connor met her gaze, his expression unreadable. "I know exactly what it looks like, but this dog's gonna die if you don't help him." For a long moment, neither of them spoke. Then, Duke let out a weak whimper. Emily's jaw tightened. She wasn't heartless. Whatever history she and Connor had, she wasn't about to let an innocent animal suffer. With an irritated sigh, she stepped aside. "Get in before someone sees you." Connor didn't hesitate. He carried Duke inside, and Rick followed reluctantly, grumbling under his breath. Emily led them to a small examination table in the back of the clinic. "Put him down here." Connor gently laid Duke onto the table, his muscles tense. Emily immediately got to work, examining the wounds. Her hands were quick and practiced, her expression shifting into focused determination. "He's lost a lot of blood," she murmured. "But none of the bullets hit anything vital. Lucky dog." Connor exhaled in relief. Emily shot him a glare. "Don't thank me yet. This isn't easy work, and I swear if the cops show up at my door tomorrow, I will personally throw you under the bus." Connor smirked. "Wouldn't expect anything less." Rick rolled his eyes. "Great. A reunion. Just what we needed." Emily ignored him and continued cleaning the wounds. Duke flinched at the touch of antiseptic but didn't fight it. His body was still weak, but there was something in his eyes, something fierce. "What the hell happened?" Emily finally asked. Connor hesitated. Then he showed her the footage. As the video played, Emily's face darkened. "This wasn't just some random attack," she murmured. "These men were professionals." Connor nodded. "Yeah. And I need to know why." Emily gave him a wary look. "Connor, if these guys were willing to attack a cop in broad daylight, what do you think they'll do to you?" Connor's expression was unreadable. "Guess we'll find out." Rick groaned. "Oh, for the love of Raven, do you hear yourself? We barely got out of there, and now you want to go hunting these guys down." Connor's voice was quiet but firm. "They're going to come looking for him." He gestured at Duke. "And if they find him, they're going to make sure he never gets the chance to lead anyone back to them." Emily sighed. "And what exactly do you plan on doing?" "You're a biker, not a detective." Connor smirked. "I don't need to be a detective. I just need to make them think I am." Rick let out a bitter laugh. "You're gonna bluff a bunch of professional killers." Connor shrugged. "Worked before." Emily shook her head, muttering something under her breath. "You always were an idiot." Connor grinned. "Missed me." Emily scowled. "Shut up and hold the damn dog still." Connor did as she asked. But deep down, he knew this was only the beginning. Whoever those men were, whoever had tried to kill Duke's handler, was still out there. And now, they had no idea that the dog they thought was dead was very much alive. And that was going to be their biggest mistake. Because if there was one thing Connor Hayes knew how to do, it was fight. The final stand. The cold night air was thick with tension as Connor Raven Hayes crouched behind a rusted-out truck in the abandoned junkyard. The moon cast long shadows over the twisted metal graveyard, and somewhere in the distance, an owl hooted, a brief reminder that life still existed beyond the war he was about to start. Duke lay beside him, his breathing more steady now, though his wounds had left him weakened. The police K9 dog had recovered enough to move on his own, but Connor could see it in his sharp, intelligent eyes. He was still fighting through the pain. Rick was a few yards away, hiding behind a stack of old tires, his grip tight on the sawed-off shotgun he had grabbed before they left Emily's clinic. The rest of the gang, 5 men who had spent their lives riding hard and living harder, were scattered throughout the junkyard, waiting for the inevitable. The black SUVs had rolled in quietly, parking just outside the perimeter of the junkyard. The men inside, professional killers, the same ones who had ambushed Duke and his handler, had come to finish the job. But they had no idea they were walking into a trap. The truth uncovered. It had taken Connor hours to piece everything together, but when he did, the truth hit him like a gut punch. The men in those SUVs weren't just criminals. They were ex-military, working for a private security contractor that had gone rogue. Duke's handler had stumbled onto something he wasn't supposed to see, evidence of illegal weapons trafficking that tied back to some very powerful people. And those people had ordered a cleanup. Connor had spent his whole life running from trouble, but something about this felt different. Maybe it was the way Duke looked at him, trusting him, depending on him. Maybe it was the fact that, for the first time in years, he wasn't thinking about himself. All he knew was that this wasn't just about revenge. It was about justice. And it was time to end this. The trap is set. Connor signaled to Rick with 2 fingers. Stay low. Stay quiet. Rick gave him a small nod, his face tense. This is suicide, man, he muttered under his breath. Connor smirked. Yeah, probably. He turned his attention back to Duke. The dog's ears twitched, his body tense with anticipation. He could sense them getting closer. Connor gave him a pat on the head. You ready, buddy? Duke let out a low, quiet growl. Good. The men stepped into the junkyard, their movements careful, their weapons drawn. They were trained, but they weren't expecting resistance. To them, Connor and his gang were nothing more than outlaws, a minor inconvenience. They were about to learn how wrong they were. A voice rang out in the darkness. We know you're here, Hayes. You've got one chance to walk away. Give us the dog, and we let you live. Connor chuckled, shaking his head. Yeah, that's funny, because from where I'm standing, you're the ones trapped. Silence. Then, chaos. The fight begins. Rick fired the first shot, his shotgun blast echoing through the night. One of the men went down instantly, his body crumpling behind the hood of a rusted-out sit-in. Connor moved fast, using the confusion to his advantage. He darted between the wrecked cars, his pistol steady in his grip. 2 men spotted him, raising their weapons, but Duke was faster. The dog launched forward, his powerful jaws clamping down on one man's arm. A scream tore through the air as the man collapsed, trying to shake the K9 off. The second man turned his gun toward Duke. Connor didn't hesitate. Bang! The man dropped before he could pull the trigger. The gang moved like a well-oiled machine. They weren't trained soldiers, but they knew how to fight. Years of street brawls and bar fights had turned them into scrappy survivors, and they fought like men with nothing to lose. Rick took down another attacker, while 2 of the gang members flanked the remaining men, cutting off their escape. One of the gunmen realized they were losing. Fall back, he shouted, scrambling toward the SUVs. Not a chance. Connor sprinted forward, closing the distance before the man could escape. He grabbed him by the collar and slammed him against the side of the SUV. Where's Duke's handler? He growled. The man struggled, his eyes wild with fear. He's dead. You can't stop this. Connor's fist connected with his jaw, sending him sprawling to the ground. Wrong answer. The man spat blood, laughing weakly. You think this ends here? There are more of us. You can't fight them all. Connor stared down at him. Maybe not, he admitted, but I can make sure you don't walk away. Before the man could respond, Duke stepped forward, standing beside Connor. The dog's fur was matted with blood, his body battered and bruised, but his eyes burned with the same fire that Connor felt deep in his chest. The man's smirk faltered, and for the first time that night, Connor saw fear in his eyes. The aftermath. The fight was over. The remaining gunmen had either fled or been taken down. Rick stood beside the wrecked motorcycles, breathing heavily, his shotgun still gripped tightly in his hands. The rest of the gang was scattered, some nursing injuries, others gathering what weapons and supplies they could from the fallen enemies. Duke sat beside Connor, panting but alert. His eyes scanned the horizon, as if still searching for something. Connor knelt beside him, running a hand through his fur. We did it, buddy. Duke let out a small whimper, resting his head against Connor's knee. Rick shook his head, letting out a low chuckle. You're a crazy son of a... He paused, exhaling. But damn if you didn't pull it off. Connor smirked. Yeah, well, remind me never to do that again. Rick laughed. Oh, you'll do it again. You've got that look. Connor didn't argue. Because maybe Rick was right. Maybe for the first time in years, he had found something worth fighting for. A new beginning. By morning, the authorities would find the bodies. The news would spread. Whoever had ordered Duke's handler's death would know that their plan had failed. But Connor wasn't worried. Because now he had Duke. And as long as they were together, he wasn't afraid of what came next. For the first time in a long time, he had a purpose. And he wasn't about to let it go. This concludes the story. Thank you for watching until the end. I hope you found it enjoyable. If you did, please consider liking the video and sharing it with your friends. Don't forget to subscribe to our channel and activate the notification bell for more captivating stories. Have a great day.